Hi everyone, welcome back to the second part of the second day. My name is George Hines. I'm Director for Data Analytics at the Healthcare Engineering Systems Center, and I'm moderating the second part of the day. And it's a pleasure to introduce to you Logan Stapleton. He speaks on behalf of Stevie Chancellor, who's an assistant professor at the Computer Science and Engineering Department at the University of Minnesota. And Logan is her fifth-year PhD grad student, and he will talk today about AI and mental health, moral panic, or meaningful concerns. The floor is yours.
Cool. I'm Logan. Nice to meet you all. Obviously, Stevie couldn't be here. She has COVID, so I am doing this talk a little last minute, so bear with me. Hope to present some earlier work and some in-progress work, as well as some just like future work and thinking about kind of less technical, but the social, ethical impacts of generative AI on this general space of mental health and mental health support online. As a very shameless pitch, I am a final year PhD student. I'm on the academic and industry job market, so if any of this interests you or you like me as a person, reach out to me afterward. Okay, and a lot of this work is done obviously in collaboration with Stevie Chancellor, as well as professors Haiyi and Bob Kraut at Carnegie Mellon. Haiyi is my advisor. So just a brief content warning. A lot of this is on severe mental health. A lot of my work and Stevie's work looks especially at dangerous mental health, like eating disorders, suicidality. So I'll talk about that throughout the presentation. If anything is like particularly distressing, feel free to take care of yourself, leave. I will be honest, I usually speak quite candidly about suicidality, especially just to kind of destigmatize. I'll give content warnings throughout the presentation, but I'll mention specific methods and talk about killing oneself and things like this throughout the presentation. Okay, so probably most people have seen a lot of like news headlines around AI chatbots recently, obviously with the advent of ChatGPT and a number of generative AI models. There's growing interest for replacing therapists. There's a number of things we've seen here, right? Trying to use ChatGPT to deliver any number of kinds of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, just chatting with a friend, things like this. I think there's a lot of potential here. I think there's a lot of problems as well. And so I'll talk about a bit of work that I've seen from others about AI chatbots and therapists and things like this. And then I'll go into my own work, taking a kind of different angle, not necessarily automating the therapeutic process, but really trying to make automated training for therapists, kind of flipping to support human infrastructures using these generative AI models. And then a little kind of future work or posturing for future work around mitigating harms within generative AI, particularly for dangerous mental health behaviors, and then just opening on some general questions. So as I go through the talk, I'll try and pose a number of questions. If anyone has like any comments throughout or at the end, I would like to keep it fairly informal and interactive. A lot of this, again, is preliminary work, and so I'm really curious like what others think about this space in general. So to get into it, just to point out some prior work that's been done on like automating the therapy process and some problems with ChatGPT therapists. One example is this company, Coco. It's a nonprofit that does a lot around automating different mental health services and creating mental health services that are more accessible. Right, so they did an experiment with 4,000 users where they took GPT-3 and essentially swapped out the usual kind of peer supporters that they have on their platform. So peer support being, these are not trained clinicians necessarily. They're people who have experience with mental health, but they're not fully well versed in it. It's someone to talk to online, right? So instead of talking to a peer about your mental health problems, now you're talking with generative AI, large language model, something like that, right? And they found when using this in Coco that a lot of people thought that the AI did fairly well, right? They rated the responses from AI significantly higher than humans or the people's responses, right? And another big goal here is making these services more accessible. Response times are difficult. It's a labor-intensive process to provide therapy. So decreasing response times, trying to broaden the number of people who can get therapy, those are kind of goals. So there's some preliminary, like maybe this is a good thing, there's some positives here. These large language models and generative AI are kind of good at providing, at least technically, what seems like good therapeutic skills. However, this experiment was somewhat of a failure. If anybody is massively on Twitter like me, there was a lot of outrage at this company, kind of deceiving people and not really telling them that they were doing this experiments, but also people who knew that they were getting therapized by these chatbots were pretty uncomfortable with it, right? They said that simulated empathy feels weird or empty. It sounds inauthentic, or maybe it's a good response, but there's no genuine effort here, right? There's not a person taking time out of their day to think about you. It's a chatbot that is generated in 3 seconds, and no matter how technically capable these models are, it seems kind of this uncanny valley or troublesome in some way when users know that they're being therapized by a chatbot. Okay, so this is one potential problem. Here, I imagine accessibility in terms of this mission that Coco has, and a lot of people in this space I think is representative of, is that mental health services are scarce, and especially in COVID-19 pandemic, the first couple of years, there was very, very few providers to be able to deal with the kind of upsurge in mental health concerns and distress. This is especially true in the global south. There's a lot of work, I'm happy to share if anyone's interested later, looking at health disparities specifically for mental health. So there's a lot of interest in how do we use these technologies to try and fill these gaps? How do we make mental health provision more accessible to people? At the same time, right, accessibility here, I think, is the other side of the sword, is that you're filling this large, disparate problem with a kind of what feels like an inauthentic model or technological fix here. At a higher level, I think beyond just the concerns of this seems weird to talk to a therapist, or I don't really trust this inauthentic response, the thing that I think seems implicit in a lot of people's outrage at these technologies that are, what I would feel is that you're dealing with life or death situations, you're dealing with incredibly consequential societal problem of a lack of healthcare, and it seems this technological fix is insufficient. And especially, I think one of the major points of seeing a therapist, if anyone sees a therapist out there, right, there is a lot of technicality of cognitive behavioral therapy or specific therapeutic approaches, but I'll talk about a little bit later in my work. What I look at is online mental health provision. So people who go online to just talk to someone who's not necessarily a professionally trained therapist, but is just like a person. And there's a lot of power, even in someone who is not very good at providing therapeutic responses or support, just to talk to someone, right? There's a lot of people in a situation that they can't talk to anybody in their daily life, and so just finding someone to talk to is the key importance here. So, right, if we're trying to automate this process where you're like, oh my God, like I'm dealing with so much in my life, I have no one to turn to, and then I go online and it's a fucking chatbot. Like, that's crushing, it seems like. So I think that broadening this accessibility or filling in these gaps of disparate healthcare, like this quote, could save some people. At the same time, it may be an insufficient response to broader mental health lapse of care. I think the next kind of part I'll talk about specific talk of eating disorders, dieting advice, and weight loss specifically. I think there's another aspect to kind of dangers of using generative AI for mental health support. Mainly that, like, when you're looking at dangerous mental health conditions, there are specific kinds of risks and harms. So this is another story, an eating disorder from the National Eating Disorder Association in the US. Their workers were trying to unionize, and maybe you saw this, I don't know. Their workers were trying to unionize, this was like early June-ish. And instead of letting them unionize and giving better provisions for their working conditions, they decided to fire everyone and replace them with a chatbot. They were told at the time the chatbot that they were contracting with was rules-based, or at least it wasn't using some sort of generative AI. They found out a little later that the company that they were contracting with iterated on their model, and so they were using some sort of language model in there. And this is like an eating disorder helpline, right? If you're dealing with a severe crisis or severe distress related to an eating disorder, you call them to try and talk to someone as well as get connected with further forms of healthcare. And what the chatbot did was recommend a number of really harmful and stigmatizing responses, right? So one of the folks, there's a link there, who reported on this said, right, when they called, they recommended like a weight loss program to this person on an eating disorder hotline, and saying things like, right, you should aim to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. So there's an additional harm here, not just for people who are dealing with general distress or depression or kind of still very serious, but more common mental health problems. There are specific, especially life-threatening, dangerous mental health conditions that there are specific harms that generative AI can replicate. Okay, so are there places where therapy bots could be responsibly deployed? There seems like a lot of potential. They seem like they're doing a good job, sort of. Where can they be responsibly deployed? Again, these are like open questions, so provocations, I guess. I think one area where they could be reasonably deployed is moving instead from automating, right, to augmenting, to human-AI collaboration, and especially like improving what I would call human infrastructures for mental health support, especially online, right? I mentioned peer support. This is like, Reddit, 7 Cups, if anyone knows that, Talk Life. There's a number of different websites and forums that provide person-to-person, lay people, untrained peer support. There's a number of works that have been trying to use generative AI to improve these untrained peer supporters' support for mental health, right? Again, this is not my own work, but there's a team out of Washington, Tim Altoff's team, that's been doing a lot of good work on this human-AI collaboration using GPT in its number of iterations to improve like empathetic responses, specific kind of therapeutic approaches, right? Like this, where if you are a support seeker and you come and you have a specific mental health concern, and then you're an untrained peer supporter maybe you try to draft a specific message, then let's have generative AI or language model to come in here and try and, one, classify what you're doing as potentially harmful or insufficient response in some way, and then recommend some response that could be better to improve any number of evidence-based approaches to providing therapy, right? So that's Tim Altoff's group in the top. I think this is a recent paper that was done very well. They saw increases in empathetic responses for peer supporters on TalkLife, an online website, using this kind of model-augmented responses. And then this is also Dee Yang at Stanford. Her group has also been doing similar work. The group that I'm working with is kind of working with Dee Yang's group. But this is one side, right? Model to help peer supporter give better responses. So we're not automating the therapeutic process. We're trying to help people who are already giving the therapy do it a little better. And right, like I mentioned, specific numbers. This was the first paper, saw a 20% increase in conversational empathy, especially for people who are struggling to provide therapeutic support, right? Peer supporters who have difficulty providing support. It can especially help them. What I like about this approach is that we're not, again, trying to automate technological infrastructures, replacing human infrastructures. We're just trying to improve it. So within this vein, some of my work is using large language models, generative AI, to try and train counselors. So one step further removed. I will give you a little bit of study context here. Specifically, what I've been looking at is suicidality support online. Suicidality, what I mean is a broad array of suicidal ideation from not so risky passive ideation all the way to very severe active crisis. So it's a broader spectrum, complicated mental health condition. Looking at a specific study context, I did this interview study, is in submission right now, talking to 11 untrained, again, online volunteers in an online peer support platform on how they respond to suicidal support seekers. This isn't the work that, I'll talk about the actual generative AI aspect of it in a second, but we talked with some of these folks about how they respond and what they think, like a design-focused study, what they think of using a number of different ML-based tools for any number of improvements in their existing support for suicidal people, right? And the two big things that I'll highlight here is, one, a lot of them did not like AI for real-time support. So the thing that I just showed you about, those two groups that were seeing empathetic responses, improvements in care on these online peer support platforms, the people that I talked to said, no, we don't really want that. One, because they didn't trust the responses, but maybe more importantly, they didn't like restrictions on the kind of autonomy that they have to give care, right? They wanted to talk to people in distress on their own, and they thought that having some suggested responses would make their responses seem more robotic, or it would just be this way for the larger platform to try and restrict the ways that they can talk to different people online. I will say a lot of the specifics of these platforms is that the platforms are a little more heavy-handed than they would be with a trained therapist, because these are untrained peer supporters, and so they don't want to let them have free reign. So they were really worried about kind of platforms using these tools to restrict their autonomy to give care. However, they really liked using generative AI and large language models for training of any kind, right? So they said that when we talk to people who are experiencing suicidality, it's really hard a lot of times. What they're doing is in a lot of these platforms, it's not suicidal person after suicidal person. It's a rare thing for someone to come and be in severe distress. Most of the time it's like breakups and general depression and more common mental health conditions like that, right? So when they meet someone who is suicidal, they freak out. It's really hard and emotionally burdensome. And so what they wanted was some preparation for this. So they could have somewhere where they could talk to someone or see what it's like to talk to someone with severe, dangerous mental health condition. That's what they would have wanted. And also, not only just for the support givers here or the online volunteers, but for the people who are coming to this site, right? It's quite a bad idea to talk to someone who has no practice in this, and you're asking them to support you where you are like on the edge of a crisis. And the people, the online volunteers, peer supporters, essentially have to learn on the fly. So they're practicing on real people in dangerous, life-threatening situations. Okay, so what we did out of this is trying to find a larger, like, two sides of a training environment. So removing people from the real conversations. How do we emulate these situations where you're talking to someone about their mental distress, right? There's the first side is this virtual patient. I'll talk about more in a second. The second side is very similar to the work that I talked about previously, where you're trying to give feedback on how you were doing, right? And the work I talked about previously, it was real-time suggestions, real-time support to peer supporters. That's one type of feedback. There's a number of different kinds of feedback that you could give in clinical training, right? They're not like telling you what to say on the fly. You have a conversation with someone, and then a clinician, a supervisor will tell you, like, here's what you did bad, here's what you did good. So there's a wider array of kinds of feedback that we can look at here, but there's opportunities for using language models in both the emulating a support seeker, someone dealing with mental health issues, as well as like the feedback process of actually training them on what they can do better or worse. Okay, so again, the feedback process, I have been doing more like preliminary work, more design work focused on this. The virtual patient, I have like a working prototype, and so I'll talk more specifically about that work. So what we're doing here is a virtual patient to emulate suicidality. Okay, so what is a virtual patient? Virtual patient is something that is like a broader domain or like method or tool in medicine, right? It's used in not just mental health, but across medical domains. It's essentially just a computer-based automated system to emulate a patient, right? A lot of times this is used not just in like therapy or dealing with, clients face-to-face. It's like you're trying to get symptoms out of a patient who walks into the ER, right? How do you emulate this in simulation? What I'm doing then is trying to make a virtual patient using large language models to emulate specifically someone experiencing suicidality. And again, suicidality is an array of kinds of distress. So I've been trying to make different virtual patients for different severities and types of suicidality. The motivation here is not only like these online volunteers need help dealing with or responding to suicidal people, but more broadly in suicidality training and a lot of mental health training, like experiential learning is really, really important. It's very effective. There's a lot of studies showing that like when you do role playing with other clinicians, or you do this kind of experiential learning, that's like the best form of teaching learning that you can do. But it's very labor intensive because either you have to have another person who can actually like emulate someone experiencing this form of distress to do this role playing with you, or a lot of times like I've done a bunch of suicidality trainings, and it's just like multiple choice responses and really unrealistic scenarios. So like this was from one of the most popular suicidality trainings. It's just kind of this, right? Your friend texted you this, you text this, and then it gives you some 4 responses that you can do and gives you some feedback on that. So there's not very good training right now that is like widely accessible and realistic for suicidality especially, but again, across a number of different mental health conditions as well. Okay, so long story short, what I've been doing is I used ChatGPT to create virtual patients to emulate people seeking support for both passive and active suicidal ideation, emulating specifically these people we're talking with online. But you could also train like any novice counselors or suicidal gatekeepers. So this is like, teachers, parents, anybody who's not a clinician but maybe wants to learn more about suicidality in their daily life. Okay, I'll show you a bit of it. Again, content warning, we'll talk about passive suicidal ideation. This is one of the conversations from it. If I have time at the end, and I might show you like a live demo, but right, this is like, what do you want to talk about? What's going on? Feeling kind of down and worthless. I've been having thoughts of not wanting to exist. Sometimes it feels like I'm disappearing, or I feel like disappearing, right? This is in gray, the virtual patient, and then this is the counselor. So here it's, talk of passive suicidal ideation, and then some maybe cause for concern or risk factors associated with that suicidality. This is a fairly trite example, but hopefully is immersive and realistic enough to provide some training. Okay, so how did we build this thing? Also, this conversation could go on much, much longer, obviously. How did we build this? I'll go through this somewhat quickly. First, our design goals here were, based on a number of prior works. There's a lot of literature on how to train therapists. What we were looking at is, general therapeutic micro skills. So this is like general active listening, giving feedback, asking questions, stuff that a lot of work has shown that, just general alliance or trust in your therapist is a lot of what contributes to successful therapy, as well as we're looking at suicide-specific skills like how to assess risk, how to respond to suicidality, especially different kinds, and then emotionally preparing for those conversations, like I mentioned in the user study that we did previously. Some of the design criteria that we've identified, right? It needs to be authentic. It needs to be realistic. Does it represent a patient with suicidality? The harm here is that if you're making something that's not realistic or it's potentially stigmatizing, that's a problem. So we want it to be realistic. We want the conversation to flow somewhat naturally. Especially we want it to be effective at training, right? Does a virtual patient allow users opportunities to learn or practice the learning goals that we identified? And then finally, one of the things that I talked about earlier with dangerous mental health behaviors is there's a lot of risk for harms or stigmatizing speech. So how do we mitigate those harms? Can we do that? Specific design methods here. I won't go too much into it, but just super briefly, one of the two things that I think are really important. First, combining kind of clinical knowledge as well as lived experience. Right, clinical knowledge, I mean diagnostic assessments. If anyone does therapy, right, you have to do your PHQ-9 and your GAD-7. These are ways of diagnosing people with specific conditions, or at least clinical descriptions of various kinds of distress or conditions, as well as I think what's really important here is how to capture lived experience. Essentially what we're doing is building personas, users to emulate here, and they can't just say I'm depressed and here's on a clinical evaluation exactly what I'm experiencing and here's my symptoms, right? They talk I don't know what I'm doing, I feel kind of down recently, my head hurts or something, where you have to use in patient's actual language. So in order to do that, it takes a lot of personal experience. Myself, I experienced a number of mental health things, including suicidality. As well, I've talked with a number of people who also experience suicidality and use different stories of people online to create these prompts. And then also the other important thing here is engaging with clinical experts and online volunteers, right? A lot of interviews, iterative design, to do what seems simple of like prompt engineering. It's a lot of like little things that hopefully make this thing more realistic and effective. And the specifics, this is kind of a larger, structure or framework for how I eventually am now structuring the prompts that I'm doing. Right, we have a persona. This is very similar to a lot of like design work, UX, UI. You're making a persona with a kind of background, age, gender, motivation for why they're coming in, right? This is a 35-year-old female teacher recently taking a job in a new school. That's what I put in one of the prompts for one of the patients. And then, right, a specific condition, the severity, risk factors, protective factors, especially what I think is important is like stigmas associated with them. I'm interested in like marginalization around mental health, and so if I can represent that in a virtual patient, I think that's really important. Another thing that came up a lot in the interviews is this kind of like openness, agreeability, and reluctance. ChatGPT is made for, and a lot of chatbots are made for like, hi, welcome to Delta. How are you doing today? What do you need from me, right? Like they're agreeable, you can kind of push them around and they're gonna be happy. So how do you make a patient that is like grumbly and doesn't wanna talk about their feelings, and if you tell them some advice about how to improve their situation, they don't listen to you? Finally, there's like specific things around conversation structure, length to make it more natural. Okay, I'm gonna look at like 2 specific conversations as well. Again, this content warning, severe suicidal ideation. I'm gonna show you one that has active crisis and talk of methods. This one I might skip because I showed you it already. I can go into more of this in a bit, but here's one that's like active suicidal crisis. I think this is particularly interesting because one, ChatGPT and a lot of language models restrict talking about suicide. Their policies say you can't talk about it at all. So we did a number of like red teaming to get around these filters to try and talk about any kind of suicidality, but especially like what we're looking at here is like specific, I'm thinking about taking pills. They're in the cabinet. This is an active crisis, specific methods. So I think this is particularly important, and especially we talked to a lot of clinicians about why this is important, right? Getting people with severe, somewhat realistic like scenarios to talk about. It's important to make the virtual patient be as severe as you might encounter in a real scenario. Okay. So the evaluation study is in progress, but generally preliminary positive results here. We've talked to a lot of clinical experts, psychologists, therapists, psychiatrists, as well as the specific domain that we started with, online volunteers, psych students as well. And it seems like people think it's a good idea, and it works pretty well. Sometimes they say it talks kind of funny, right? It's like very formal, ends every sentence in a period. You would never see someone online talking like that, but it's realistic enough, and it puts people in a situation that is important to train novice counselors on. Okay, I think there's a lot of like future work to be done here. This is kind of one pretty preliminary prototype of a specific mental health condition. All I want to say is like this works, and we should be redirecting some of our efforts away from like giving people suggestions on what to say for therapy, and rather trying to make some of these like virtual patients and training scenarios, right? So currently making like virtual patients for ADHD, OCD, different other life situations, as well as creating frameworks for designing these virtual patients overall. I think large language models are generally good at role playing. This is something that they do very well, and so I think it's a natural fit both technically as well as like this is a good area to design in general. Good?
Thanks for the nice talk. So you would think that when you train a virtual patient, it would be useful to sort of use the same language that a real patient would use. But that would, of course, lead to privacy issues if you sort of go to a counselor and try to find out what their exact conversation was. So it seems to be that you're using just sort of something from a textbook or standard references, but working with a language that a real patient might use would be, I would think would be better, right? And then there'd be some, so do you have any thoughts on that and you know, the associated privacy issues in dealing with something like that?
Yeah, I think this is like something that I've thought about a lot. The standard way of dealing with mental health data online is like crisis text line, kind of gotten a lot of heat for using private chat data. I think it's really ethically dubious to use a lot of this private chat data, especially for severe mental health distress, where I would think that a lot of people can't reasonably consent to that data collection or future use. So I haven't used any sort of, I could, if I wanted to, I guess, get like records from any number of places. It's hard. I would say two things. One, I don't think that you necessarily need to use real chat data. I think this is where like the lived experience comes in really importantly, right? So for me, like a lot of these virtual patients, it's like the things that I deal with and how I talk about these things, and then how like friends or people who I've interviewed like talk about these things as well. And so it's a lot of like iterative, like checking, member checks on whether these things are talking about them in a realistic way. I think it's a whole nother beast to like figure out a way to collect the kind of private chat data that you might need here in an ethical or privacy preserving way. And it's something that I'm really interested in the future. At this point, I think that it's like using these participatory approaches is like a pretty good way. It's obviously labor intensive and it's not that technically like cool, but I think it's pretty good at doing the job.
Thanks.
Have you ever experimented with retrieval augmented generation related to this task, like ingesting some research papers related to mental health in a vector database and then maybe hooking up with this system?
Yeah, I haven't, but I imagine that you could. I think that's an area for like future research, like how to automate this process of creating the virtual patients, especially essentially automating the process that I did, right? Reading a bunch of research papers and like talking to clinicians and psychologists and things about specific conditions. And that's, I think, one of the hard things with like branching out to other conditions. I don't have ADHD, I don't have like OCD, all these things, right? So either I go and find a group of users that like experiences these things and can help me out with this, or I can try and like figure out how to automate that process without this lived experience. I don't know. I think it's a good idea. I also think that like it seems like automation on automation, right? Like the automation here is like there's very few resources for experiential learning already, so I don't think that you need an enormous amount of different virtual patients to get like good training modules already. I could be wrong. Like I'm very curious about like automating the process of making these virtual patients, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the nice talk. I think you mentioned there are like different levels of like suicidality, and then you were able to create like different virtual bots patients for that. how did you how many levels are there, and were you able to represent to create for all, or you selected different ranges for this experiment?
Yeah, so I made 3. I have a clinical diagnostic assessment that's used, evidence-based and widely used in the field. So I identified 3 kind of less severe passive, more moderate severe active suicidal ideation, and then active crisis. And again, a lot of these was it's pretty labor intensive at this point to make these virtual patients, but I think it's important to make them as realistic and effective as possible. I think there's again, a lot of opportunities for making a wider array of experiences and conditions. I think one big limitation to this is because I am using this lived experience, it's very rooted in my own positionality. And so how different, suicidality as well as different kinds of mental health conditions differs very widely based on any number of demographic or situational factors. So I think there's a lot of future work to be done to represent a wider array of mental health conditions.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Logan.
Sweet. Thank you.